would you please explain much more about how the work you do on sex workers?
Right. Look, for me, because when I was growing up, like when I was doing my undergraduate and my masters in the city, one of the most path-breaking movements that happened in the city was the Durbar movement.
Okay.
And it started in the 90s, sort of mid-90s. I wouldn't say mid-90s, sort of mid to late 90s. And that's when we were sort of, recently passed out postgraduates, we were in a certain sense looking for exciting new things to be part of, social movements, whatever. And we were all part of the women's movement anyway. But we as young people in the women's movement, we always felt that, sexuality was an issue that was not being addressed. And when it was being addressed in terms that we were quite unhappy with. And this is also the time when, the whole sort of HIV/AIDS thing became very, very important and people became very conscious. And I think one of the things that HIV/AIDS really did to public discourse was, I think, very important. It forced all of us, and most importantly, it forced the state to start talking about sexuality. And I still remember, the sort of the wonder with which we looked at the first HIV ads, because before that there was nothing like that in the public domain. We didn't talk about condoms that much. The word for condom was nirod. You would say nirod rather than condom. The generic word was never used because there was a lot of shyness about it. But suddenly it became okay in the public domain to talk about the condom as a condom. So these were important things. So I think public discourse changed importantly, and one of the words, I think, the very, very important contributions of Durbar, I think, that if they had done nothing else, the contribution of the word sex worker to the Bengali vocabulary, I think, is extraordinary. The word is Jono Karmi, which is, Jono is sexual, and worker. So the idea of connecting work with sex.
Erstwhile, what was the word that they used?
Prostitute, besha. These were the words that we always used. And as sort of middle class women, even using those words was kind of taboo for us. And, we knew those words and we knew what they meant, but we would use the English word. For instance, we would say prostitute or whatever.
English is a gentleman's
language. So, we wouldn't use the Bangla word. And for us, it was very, very liberating to have a word which was not moralistic and which was actually saying something really new, which was looking at sex as work, and that it was possible to look at sex as work. So in a certain sense, I would say it was a discursive revolution. It was a revolution in terms of word use and what you could say, and it was also through discursiveness, of course, a conceptual leap was happening. So I think it was a very important moment for all of us who were trying to be in some way part of a women's movement. And we were talking about dowry, we were talking about other kinds of issues, we were talking about rape, we were talking about molestation, generally violence against women, whatever, but we were not taking the issue of sexuality head on ever, before that. And one of the things that Durbar really did was to force us to do that. And also, in the initial days, I think Durbar was a very open organization in many ways, because it was trying to make links with other movements. It was trying to build alliances, which was very important, because Durbar should never be a movement just for sex workers. I mean, it is important to address the issue of sex workers, but I think the more important thing is for Durbar to reach out and actually sort of talk to other organizations, so that other organizations can look at them differently.
So what organizations were these?
They were working with trade unions at the beginning. So they were approaching trade unions, they were talking to ministers, they were talking to the government. And the government was also much more open then, because it was the moment of HIV. And the government actually needed sex workers to be able to penetrate a kind of population that they didn't have access to otherwise. And they didn't know how to reach that. It was what they call the shadow areas or grey areas, because the clients and one of the primary targets of the HIV discourse was the sex workers client. And the big condom campaign, that sex workers should use condoms. And that was not possible without addressing, or without actually sort of addressing the community of sex workers. So the only way that the government could actually tackle HIV was by having the sex workers on their side. So that was a particular kind of historical moment where the government actually recognized the importance of sex workers in their health campaigns, which is why Durbar was even possible. But what I find absolutely exciting and wonderful, which we are no longer, I don't think, those moments are coming in our lives anymore, that Durbar didn't become a kind of tool of the government. It didn't just become like a program implementation organization. That it could actually become a movement. Because it took the opportunity to develop a different kind of a campaign. So it wasn't limited to, clients have to use condoms and let us just go to government hospitals, get these condoms, distribute them. Because they realized that nobody would agree. I mean, it had to be something, because, unless you create a certain kind of resistance, awareness among the sex workers themselves, solidarities, why would they risk their, business? Because the clients were not agreeing to use condoms. So they would, they would say, okay, we'll take the risk, it doesn't matter. So it had to be a kind of joint campaign where all the sex workers were refusing. If I refuse and then he goes to another lane and he gets somebody to agree, then, there's no movement. So he would always go to that woman.
So Durbar did that.
Durbar did that. So, they used this opportunity to create a kind of solidarity which was amazing. And more importantly, not just solidarity among brothel-based sex workers. They also included, the poorer sex workers in for instance, there's a sort of whole hierarchy of brothels. I'm sure every city has that. So there is one central district which is, slightly more important.
Sumanto Banerjee speaks about that.
So there are smaller areas, smaller districts as well, where there are poorer sex workers. So they got all these, and they started working in the districts. They started working in other cities in West Bengal. So they were really reaching out, and they also started working with the sex workers we call the flying sex workers, who are not brothel based, and it's very difficult to actually reach out to them because they are a kind of floating population. So and because the government also thought that they were the most risky or at-risk people, because they were not covered by any movement, etc. So Durbar was actually reaching out to all these people, and it became really almost in a few years it just developed into this huge movement, which was not just nationally known, it was internationally known, and was seen as one of the most successful case studies of HIV communication. Because they were doing much more than HIV communication. So if they were only doing HIV communication, it wouldn't have been so successful. So that is my argument, that it was, everybody sort of tries to claim Durbar as a sort of successful HIV strategy implementation. But because it wasn't just strategy implementation, it was so successful. Because it was a movement. And most importantly, it was trying to reach out not just to workers' movements, other kinds of grassroots level movements, but it was also reaching out to the women's movement in significant ways. In fact, in the mid-90s, we had this sort of almost historic seminar here in Jadavpur University, right across the corridor we had. And just the experience of a group of sex workers coming into the university. It was something else. For the students, it was a life-changing experience. I mean, and also in terms of, what the city had seen, or the way in which the city had seen them. They were now going to seminars, conferences, they were traveling internationally, they were talking about, how they had built up the movement. So this was a completely different kind of a historical moment, and I think unrepeatable in many ways. And there was an excitement and energy in that movement, which now I find a little bit in the LGBT movement. And I just feel that the women's movement was almost, in the doldrums, and suddenly Durbar sort of revived all of it, and we started, asking very important questions about women's sexualities. And I think so. Durbar has done a lot for other movements also. So apart from what Durbar represents in terms of
bringing marginal sexualities.
Definitely.
And asking questions about sexuality itself.
Asking questions about married women.
Okay. So
questions about how we morally frame the married woman. That a lot of sex workers are actually married.
Yeah.
And that marriage means nothing.
Yeah, that's said in one of I forgot his name. There's a short story in Hindi, short story writer in Manto.
Yeah.
He has done works on this.
Yeah.
Would you please explain about the sexuality issue, sexuality as such?
I think we spent, because Durbar used to organize these big sort of almost all night seminars where sex workers would come from all over the country. They would usually do it on 3rd March, which was the HIV/AIDS day.
Okay.
And I still remember, they had to negotiate with the government. The government wouldn't give them any venue.
Okay.
Because they were seen as, loose women or whatever. But how these girls, they got to negotiate with the police, which was a hugely oppressive force.
Okay.
And also with the government. And kind of the solidarity that they had built organizationally, how it got represented outside, and increased confidence, and how they were actually, it's also in many ways a visual revolution, because these were women we hadn't seen at the heart of the city before. Yes. They were occupying places like Esplanade, or we didn't think of them outside of Shonagachi before, and suddenly the city was transformed. So
they were coming into the public
space. They're coming into the university. They're going into the Thana. They're going into writers' building.
Okay.
So this is a different kind of a city. So the city transformed.
Yeah.
So, and I think they were, their language was different. The way they were dressed was different. So they brought in a kind of sexual energy into movements, into the language of movement itself, which we hadn't sort of seen before, which is also similar kinds of things are happening with the Gay Pride March or whatever. We haven't seen that kind of colors or those kinds of slogans, that kind of uninhibited display of the body. We hadn't seen any of that. And because a lot of the sex workers, as you said, were from alternative sexual orientations, there were male sex workers who were also joining the movement. So it sort of really revolutionized the ways in which we thought or spoke about sex.
Yeah.
And these women were very free in the way that they were talking about sex. And I remember, I was talking about these all-night conferences they used to organize. And I just remember, being so excited that we would spend the entire night, this big stadium in Salt Lake. The sports minister then gave them that stadium, and they said, you organize your thing.
Okay.
Which was a huge victory, and because it was a government stadium.
Okay.
And it was, the sex workers' meet was being held there. Women had come from Canada, from other parts, South Africa, all sex workers. And I remember just sitting there and the electrifying atmosphere where, the women were talking in this completely free way. And within the women's movement, we never actually addressed sexuality in those terms. And it freed us to be able to feel certain things, to be able to talk about certain things, even, understand certain things. And I still have a friend called Shikha.
Okay.
Who was part of Durbar, is no longer part of Durbar.
Okay.
And I remember how, just talking to her was, for me, every day it was like learning new things. Because they were, in a certain sense, they were also dispelling this whole mystery and this mystique around sex.
Okay.
By talking in such commonplace terms about it.
Yeah.
And also the fact that, they had lovers. Who were not their clients, sometimes who were also their clients. So this sort of difference that we thought existed between commercial sex and romantic sex, all of that, that it's actually a very mixed experience. That, your lover can become your client, that your client can become your lover, that you can be married and be a sex worker. All these boxes that we had in our mind, suddenly sort of, we realized, it all collapsed. And that, again, that all of this could be work.
Okay, yeah.
So even the difference between, say, a prostitute and a worker collapsed. So I think it was very heady times for all of us, and we learned a whole lot of new things. And then I had to go off, large part of the 90s. I was not in the country. I was abroad doing my PhD. So, but I would come back and I would always have a sort of sense of the pulse of the movement.
Okay.
So after I came back and I joined here, I've always maintained contact with Durbar, and Durbar then went through several phases.
Okay.
One of them, again, a lot of that had to do with the changes, because at the end of the day, this is not something I even want to talk about, but because you're asking, because all movements, they have an energy of their own. They begin in a certain kind of way, and then they become funding dependent. They become, other kinds of issues come in, politicized in certain ways. I wouldn't say Durbar was politicized, but I do think, my disappointment with Durbar is that it lost a lot of that voluntarism.
Okay.
That voluntary energy that it had. And it started sort of cashing in on its huge popularity and its huge reach, its huge success. It sort of became more complacent, more relaxed. So after a while I started feeling, and also, the whole sort of Bill Gates and Belinda Gates, the huge HIV fund that they built. Suddenly I found that sex workers had become, almost employees.
Corporates.
Regular workers, they would, it became very respectable, they would sort of wear the sari in a certain way and, go to office every day and, do workouts. And they ceased to be sex workers, although they were representing sex workers. And they were actually saying that, I don't do dhanda anymore because, it is, I don't like doing dhanda or whatever. But, the whole point of Durbar was that, not to condemn the profession, but to see the profession as a profession.
Okay.
But if you suddenly become respectable and professional, and then you say, it's good that I can avoid this, then you're not representing the spirit of Durbar. I'm not saying, you have to advertise sex. That is not the point I'm making. But if you share the same middle class anxieties about sex work that everybody else has, then you are not doing a service to the sex workers' cause. I mean, that's what I feel. So I just felt it got too professionalized and NGOized in a certain sense, funding dependent. And then when Bush came to power, they passed this legislation in America saying that none of the HIV organizations could give money that would support sex workers.
Okay.
Because they saw it as immoral.
Okay.
So you wouldn't promote immoral trade. Which immediately sent all these sex workers organizations into a complete dizzy, because, they saw that the funding was drying up. Durbar reacted in a very interesting, I would say very intelligent, strategic way. Durbar said that we are now going to call ourselves entertainment workers.
Okay.
And they started making these alliances with other entertainment workers like theatre artists or dancers, bar dancers, whatever. But I thought that didn't work. It didn't work because a lot of these dancers, theatre artists, they didn't want to be associated with sex workers. Because anyway they struggle, to prove that they are dancers and not sex workers. So to be associated organizationally with Durbar was not good for them. But I thought, I would say this was 2005-06, I might be wrong, I mean my dates might be off a little bit. But that is when I started getting a little disappointed, because I thought the whole point was to call yourself a sex worker and be a sex worker. If you called yourself an entertainment worker, you were actually trying to become respectable. And you were losing the point, you were losing the plot. So that is when I started sort of getting less interested or whatever, going less. Now, I still am, I don't know, part of some of their committees, whatever. I hardly go now. Because I just feel it's too bureaucratized now, and I miss that energy. But I still have friends among the sex workers. Many of them are not part of Durbar anymore because of internal politics, dynamics, leadership has changed. But I'm still very welcome there, and I still go there on World HIV Day, or if they organize any programs, they call me. Sometimes I go for their planning meets. But it's not the same anymore.
Like in Kerala, there has been autobiography by a sex worker, Nalini Jamila. So, are there any works by sex workers over here?
Not.
She especially in her work, she especially critiques the middle class hypocrisy.
Right, and rightly so.
Yeah. And does such critiques come?
We have a lot of vernacular literature.
Okay.
But they haven't actually been translated into English, so they are not very popular.
These are written by sex workers.
Well, some of them are. One of them, for instance, which is a Durbar publication, is written by a sex worker's son about his mother, reminiscences of his mother. And there are publications like that. I mean, Durbar itself has done several publications, which is... but a lot of these narratives, I mean, a lot of books have actually been written about, sex workers in Durbar.
Okay.
But they have become narratives of the movement. They have become narratives of how their lives change. They are not really narratives of a sex worker. It's more like sex workers movement.
Okay.
But there are older narratives. In Bangla there is we call them bottola. Bottola is a banyan tree.
Okay.
So this was a custom, old 19th century Bengali custom, that people would gather under a banyan tree and just talk and often about things which are not very respectable. So these are called Bottola publications. So it's like a gossip. Like
this is done by Durbar.
No, Durbar doesn't participate in Bottola publication. Durbar tries to sort of publish kinds of narratives which really become Durbar narratives. They are not. Even now, if you go and talk to sex workers who are part of Durbar, they will give you a particular kind of narrative which Durbar approves. They wouldn't really talk about their lives in the way that they could have probably before. So it's if you belong to an organization, I suppose these things happen. But the kind of narratives I'm talking about are sort of 19th century narratives. A lot of them were actually written by men who were clients, but who were pretending to be the women. So it's written in first person, but they're not really first person women's narratives. So there's a range of, and there were lots of narratives, lots of satires written about Shonagachi in the 19th century. So collections of these have come out. There's one very famous narrative which is by Binodini Dashi, who was not a regular sex worker, she was an actress. But she gives a kind of story which helps you to understand how Shonagachi was organized. She never lived in Shonagachi herself, but she had friends and she had a larger network of people.
Yeah, even I read her book in that she says about after acting in some play, the middle class, some guy said that how can she be a goddess or something? She really attacks this morality and everything. But
so there are narratives like that, but the kind of narratives that you're saying, Jamila, that similar kind of thing hasn't come out. I mean, because unless it's translated into English and sort of Penguin or somebody distributes it, you don't get that kind of thing.